This is the first part of the third lecture series for research methods on measurement and validity. We will be looking today at levels of measurement and levels of analysis also. And part of the goal will be to continue to work on explaining why measurement is a critical foundation for behavioral research, which hopefully is something that's starting to become quite clear. Just as a reminder, there are a range of different measurement techniques we'll be looking at in the course. Some of these things will involve basically ordering and counting observed phenomena. So you can, as I pointed out before, count just about anything, whether it be words, elections, dollars, numbers of ads placed. There are different places you can go and find the things that you might want to count or in some way, in fact, classify, which is another way we might think about measuring things. So this could be through government statistics, corporate statistics, newspapers, archives, existing surveys. You can do content analysis to turn text into categories or numbers. You can do the same types of things with observed behavior. So like how many observed violations, how many polluters are identified and prosecuted by the government. There's also network measurement, which we won't talk a lot about in this course, but there is an advanced course on this issue available within the DAPL sequence. Asking people, whether it be perceptions or self-reported behaviors, is another great measurement technique. We'll be looking at survey questions, interviews, in some cases sorting tasks or implicit attitudes, which are something we'll be looking at briefly in the course. There's also experimental manipulations, which we'll be looking at in week 4. So these can take different forms, whether it be a media message or a priming task. And there are advanced measurement techniques. We won't look at those in depth in this course. I might mention them or describe them to you, but there are advanced courses available, again, within DAPLs and elsewhere in the university on advanced measurement techniques using statistical methods, such as factor analysis or structural equation modeling, or other types of automated cluster analysis increasingly. So, if we think about the measurement process, in the previous lecture series, we looked at how we would identify theoretical constructs and choose one or more indicators or variables. But there's still an issue that we need to think about, which is level of analysis, level of measurement. And the techniques, the precise techniques are some of the ones we might have just talked about. So, level of analysis, which is a measurement concept. Now, in some of your research questions and hypotheses, there is often an issue, and I pointed out in a few of the comments, where people are confusing these different levels of analysis. So there are some things that we might measure at the individual level, say income. We can measure individual income, but when we start to talk about something like a wage gap, that is actually to some extent a group comparison, right? So it's the average wage in one group versus the average wage in another group. However, if we control for individual level characteristics, we can still do that project at the individual level of measurement. So when you think about, though, something like, does a cultural enclave have an effect on economic well-being, that might be something that is in fact measured at the group level, because we can't think about a cultural enclave as belonging to an individual. It's something that characterizes an entire group. Or if we want to think about whether or not there is a difference across different individuals based on whether or not the state minimum wage is in effect, that's actually sort of a multi-level analysis, in fact, what it's called, because we're thinking about whether the existence of a minimum wage law and the set amount of the minimum wage law is set at the group level, even though the outcomes that we care about, say, economic well-being, might be measured at the individual level, or whether or not people get jobs or not. That can again be measured at the individual or group, but again, you have to be careful, really careful in thinking about the hypotheses you do, whether you're thinking about a group level of analysis or an individual, or in fact some sort of a multi-level model, which is a more advanced technique. Now, when you're identifying theoretical constructs, one of the things you could think about is that, say, many demographics are measured at the individual level, so they can in fact be measured at the group level. Political interest is usually an individual level. Religiosity, ideology, support for some policy, social media usage. However, you have to be careful. So for example, whether or not an individual has absolute pitch might be considered an individual level, but the prevalence of absolute pitch would be considered a group level. In much the same sense, individual income is individual level, but a wage gap might be considered a group level. When we start thinking about things like economic growth, state capacity, institutions, war, these are all, in essence, group and often state level variables. If you're thinking about policies such as lunch length or deregulation, these are, again, often group levels. And so you have to be careful whether or not you're actually then trying to match it with an individual level variable. It can be done, but it requires a little bit more precision and often an advanced model to capture these relationships. Part of how you can get clearer, because of the constructs themselves are a bit fuzzy, is thinking about the actual indicator or variable you're going to choose. So if we're interested in measuring class and we measure it as income or education or parents' occupation, those are obviously individual level variables. If you're thinking about the existence of free and fair elections, if you're thinking about GNP per capita, the size of a military, those are all in different cases pretty clearly state level variables. Now, one thing to keep in mind, and I think that in this way the biologists and biology as a metaphor for social sciences has some real strengths to recommend it, is because the biologists recognize, unlike, say, Lord Kelvin, who we looked at last week, that it's not simply about counting or even measuring in this counting way that is the most fundamental process in the study of the material universe, and I would say the social universe as well. But the first thing you have to do is classify. So what type of thing is this? The way we talked about, is this a bird? Is this not a bird? Does it belong to this category? Now, one of the nice things is that there is, in fact, a level of measurement we can think about that does not require us to count, but only requires us to classify. So that is a level of measurement and not a level of analysis. And therefore, it's important to attend not just to the level of analysis, but after that also recognize that level of measurement distinctions do not always require us to actually quantify. They only require us to classify. So a nominal level of measurement is what we call a discrete. You'll sometimes heard it called a dummy variable, but this is simply a classification. Country, is this person from Algeria? Are they from Russia? Are they from the United States? Are they from Czech Republic? In all of those cases, we aren't counting the Americanness or the Russianness of a person. We're just saying which category do they belong to. So we're only classifying. Same with gender. We aren't saying some people are more male or more female, or some people are more white or less white. Instead, we're simply classifying what type of group this unit of analysis we're looking at belongs to. Occupation, much the same. Now, people have tried to order occupations to measure class, so there are higher status and lower status occupations. But in and of itself, whether you're a doctor or a plumber can be thought of as simply a nominal classification. Still counts, though, as a variable because it is a level of measurement that is a nominal measure. Ordinal measures allow us to get a little bit closer to counting, but we don't have to go all the way there. So it is the case that we might say, okay, if you have both a free press and you have free elections and you have the rule of law, that if you have those three characteristics, you're more democratic than if you only have two of them. But we don't necessarily have to agree how much more democratic you are if you have three of those characteristics and only two of them. So that would be called an ordinal. You know that whatever it is you're trying to measure, say education, it's the same type of thing. Maybe we don't think each year of education has a linear impact, but we know that having a college education is different than having only a high school education, and perhaps even different than having a graduate degree. In that case, all we have to do is put in order the different classes that we've assigned our variable to, but we don't have to necessarily establish that one belonging to class 1 is exactly 4 more units than belonging to class 5, only that classes 1 through 5 have some sense of order. So we often see this in a war would be another example of this. Now, it gets a bit trickier distinguishing between ordinal and interval levels of measurement. So ordinal just means we can put things in an order. We don't make assumptions about how far apart 1 is from 2 and 2 is from 3, but we know they're in an order. Interval, we do make some assumptions about the idea that a 1 is far away from 2 as 2 is from 3 as 3 is from 4. So often we'll see agree, disagree on the 5-point scale, or agree, disagree on the 7-point scale. We will see, didn't like it all, like a whole lot, right? Those are interval level measurements, and we treat them as if they were basically ratio level measurements. And really what you will find is that in a lot of cases, we'll end up treating even ordinal level measurements that have at least 7 categories as if they were more continuous. So let me define continuous and then talk a little bit about why it is that we treat these as different, as more, when we get into modeling them, we can treat them as if they were all ratio. So a ratio variable is one in which there is the difference between 1 and 2 is the same as the difference between 2 and 3 is the same as the difference between 3 and 4, but 0 has meaning. So salary, years worked, people killed. These are all things where a 0 means you didn't kill anyone. Whereas a 0 on the strongly disagree to strongly agree scale doesn't necessarily mean anything. Now you could put it at the midpoint, but then do we really think that -1, -2, right? It gets a little bit tricky. It doesn't quite have a meaning. So that is the big difference between ratio and interval. Ordinal, again, we assumed there wasn't the difference between 1 and 2 is not the same as the difference between 2 and 3. Now, what we can actually do to check these things is we can plot them. And these are more advanced diagnostics of measurement that we might talk about later on. Really, you would be more likely to talk about them in an advanced course. But what is important for us whenever we go in and do things is that we recognize that we might want to put in as we start to model relationships between variables, we might want to treat things differently depending on whether they're either interval or ratio, which we're going to treat as a set, which means the differences between 1 and 2, there's a linear progression in the categories, as to one where an ordinal variable where there's a nonlinear progression. So we might have to treat those categories more, break them into, in essence, nominal variables in order to model them correctly. What is important here is what we're really thinking about is that when we have something like whether there's war or not, or even when we break it down into 4 classes, say, of war, what we believe is there's some underlying latent variable or construct called wariness or warness or violence of the conflict. And that what we're trying to do when we impose a category is sort of cut that into, yes, we're going to call it peace, or no, we're going to call it war. But again, there's some underlying dimension called conflict or warness or peaceness, right? That is what we're really measuring. And we're just seeing a substantial, an empirical instantiation in which we're sort of putting a threshold and we're saying everything below this threshold we're going to call peace and everything above it we're going to call war. But we can make some assumptions about that. And again, in more advanced topics, you'll see that it matters that that's how we imagine what we're doing when we're measurement. And if we make different assumptions about what the distribution is of underlying conflict, we might get some slightly different results. So again, advanced topic, but it's good to have in mind that the way that we're thinking about levels of measurement actually end up having some real implications as you move on in statistical analysis as to how you end up modeling the relationships between variables. That is it for this section, and now we'll move on to the part 2 of the lecture series.